On the 10th of March, 1971, the cancellation of a car was announced in the pages of the Times newspaper. Not a recall, not a scandal. A car that didn't exist yet, killed in a national newspaper before a single one had ever been sold. 3 days later, the same paper reported something close to a mutiny. Inside a factory in Solihull, Rover's own engineers were in open revolt. Years of their work had just been buried, and the men who built it weren't allowed to say a word about who had done it or why. Because here's what makes this one sting. The car they'd killed wasn't a failure. By every account of the people who drove the prototypes, it was a world-beater. This is the story of the Rover P8, the great British car that was finished before it ever began. And the man who pulled the trigger is more famous than the car he killed. To understand why a finished car gets killed, you first have to understand who Rover was. Because Rover in the 1960s was not the company you might be picturing. Forget the tired image of British Leyland, the strikes, the rust, the breakdowns. That came later. The Rover of this era was something else entirely. This was the company that built the Land Rover, the toughest vehicle on the planet, sold everywhere from English farms to African deserts. This was the company that in 1970 unleashed the original Range Rover and effectively invented the luxury off-roader, the entire category of car the whole world drives today, traced back to one British idea. And this was the company whose big saloons, the P5 and the P6, had earned a nickname that tells you everything about how they were regarded. People called them the poor man's Rolls-Royce. That nickname matters, so sit with it for a second. A Rover was the car you bought when you wanted the dignity, the wood, the leather and the quiet of a Rolls, but you were a high court judge or a government minister or a captain of industry, not a duke. Prime ministers were driven in them. Harold Wilson had one. Margaret Thatcher had one. The Rover was the establishment's car, respectable, serious, almost Rolls-Royce, but not quite. And not quite was exactly the gap Rover decided to close. In the late 1960s, the company's engineers looked at their grand old P5 saloon, by then aging, and decided their next flagship wouldn't sit just below Rolls-Royce. It would climb up and stand level with the giants. They gave it a code name, P8, and what they built behind closed doors would have changed how the world saw British luxury cars, if the world had ever been allowed to see it. So what exactly was so dangerous about it? Start with what was under the bonnet, because Rover had a secret weapon and it had bought it for a bargain. Years earlier, Rover had quietly acquired the rights to an aluminium V8 engine that an American company, Buick, had given up on. Everyone else saw a discarded engine. Rover saw treasure. That lightweight V8 would go on to power Rovers and Land Rovers for the next 40 years. One of the smartest purchases in the history of the British car industry. For the P8, they enlarged it to 4.4 litres, a big, smooth, muscular V8 in a car that was supposed to whisper. The bones of something genuinely fast and genuinely grand, but the engine was the ordinary part. It's the rest of the car that should make you sit up. The P8 was designed with the Dion rear suspension, sophisticated, expensive engineering usually reserved for proper sports cars, here fitted to a luxury saloon to give it both a magic carpet ride and real composure in the corners. The braking and steering were built around a hydraulic system inspired by Citroën, the French company that was, at the time, the absolute world authority on making a car glide. Rover wasn't copying the establishment. It was reaching past them, borrowing the cleverest ideas in the entire industry and bolting them into one car. The styling came from David Bache, the man who shaped the Range Rover, with a smooth, modern, almost American grandeur, including a bold, bumperless nose years ahead of its time. And this was not a sketch on a drawing board. This was real. Rover spent around £5 million developing it. An enormous sum then, the kind of money you only commit when you fully intend to build something. Prototypes were running. They were being hammered around test tracks. They were even shipped off to Finland to be tortured in the ice and snow, the way you only test a car you're genuinely about to sell. Production space had been cleared and set aside at the Solihull factory. The machinery was nearly ready. The car was, by every measure, almost here. By the planned launch, the P8 had grown into something far bigger and grander than any Rover before it, a true heavyweight, aimed squarely at the territory where Jaguar, Mercedes, and yes, at the very top, Rolls-Royce all lived. The people who drove the prototypes believed they had a world-beater on their hands, a car of the same caliber as the brilliant Rover SD1 that would arrive years later and win Car of the Year. Everything was in place: the engine, the engineering, the styling, the money, the factory space. A British luxury car ready to take on the world. And that, precisely that, was the problem. Because the P8 was now so good and aimed so high that it had started to frighten someone. Someone who didn't work for Rover at all. Here's the piece that turns this from a sad story into a genuinely dark one. In 1968, Rover had been swept into a vast, forced industrial merger, the creation of British Leyland, a single giant company that swallowed nearly every British carmaker and crammed them all under one roof: Rover, Triumph, Austin, Morris, and Jaguar. Brands that had spent decades as deadly rivals were suddenly, overnight, supposed to be teammates. They were not teammates. They were rivals locked in the same cage, now fighting over the same money, the same factory space, the same customers, except now the fighting happened in boardrooms, behind closed doors, where the public couldn't see it. And inside that cage was a man named Sir William Lyons, the founder of Jaguar. By this point, one of the most powerful and respected figures in the entire British motor industry, and, crucially, an influential voice inside the new British Leyland. Lyons had just launched his masterpiece, the Jaguar XJ6, a car so good and so underpriced that buyers were waiting up to 2 years to get one. The XJ6 was Jaguar's golden goose. It was the car keeping the whole prestige end of British Leyland alive. Now look at what was coming up the road behind it. The Rover P8, a big, fast, advanced, beautifully engineered British luxury saloon aimed at almost exactly the same wealthy buyer the XJ6 was built for. 2 cars from the same company about to fight each other for the same wallets. When British Leyland sat down to review where its money was going, the P8 came under sharp scrutiny, and the sources are clear that Sir William Lyons was among its critics. Read that plainly. The founder of Jaguar, sitting in a position of real power, helped pass judgment on a car that threatened his own Jaguar. And the judgment was death. Now, I have to be straight with you here, because your trust is worth more than a dramatic story. Nobody ever signed a confession. There was no smoking gun, no memo that says, "Kill the Rover to save my Jaguar." To this day, suggestions of conspiracy swirl around the P8's cancellation without final proof. But the circumstances are damning, and the people closest to it clearly smelled something rotten, which is exactly why Rover's engineers, when the axe fell, were reportedly furious, and exactly why no names were allowed to appear in the newspaper. You don't gag people over an innocent business decision. The axe came down in the spring of 1971. £5 million, 3 years of work, prototypes tested on 3 continents' worth of conditions, factory space cleared, all of it switched off, 6 months from the finish line. Gone. And the men in Solihull who'd poured their lives into it could only watch and seethe and stay silent. So that's the tragedy. A world-beating British car strangled in its cradle by the politics of its own company. Except, and this is where I have to be honest with you, because the easy version of this story is a lie of omission. It might not have been the wrong decision. I know. After everything I've just told you, that's a hard turn to take. But the best stories don't flinch from the inconvenient part, so here it is. 2 years after the P8 died, in 1973, the oil crisis hit. Fuel prices exploded overnight, and suddenly the entire market for big, thirsty 4.4-litre luxury saloons, exactly the kind of car the P8 was, began to collapse across Europe. If Rover had launched the P8 in 1972 as planned, it would have sailed straight into that storm. A brand new, expensive, fuel-hungry flagship, arriving just as the world decided it could no longer afford fuel-hungry flagships. And there's more the honest version has to admit. By the accounts that later emerged, the P8 would not have been cheap or easy to build. It was complex. It was expensive. British Leyland was hemorrhaging money and would, within a few years, have to be rescued by the government with a vast injection of public cash just to survive. A company drowning like that, pouring millions into a thirsty luxury saloon at the exact moment the luxury saloon market fell off a cliff. You can see, can't you, how a cold-eyed accountant might call killing it the right call, whatever the messy motives behind it. So, which is it? A brilliant car murdered by a jealous rival, or a doomed expensive indulgence that a broke company was lucky to escape? The honest answer is probably both at once, and that's what makes the P8 such a perfect, painful symbol of the whole British car industry in that era. It wasn't that Britain couldn't build great cars. The P8 proves they could. The engineering was world-class, the ambition was real, the talent was there. The problem was everything around the car, the chaos, the infighting, the mergers that turned brilliant rivals into enemies under one roof, the money troubles that meant every bold idea was one boardroom review away from the scrap heap. Britain didn't lack the genius. It lacked the calm, the cash, and the unity to let the genius survive. The story doesn't quite end at the scrapyard, though, and the footnote is its own small heartbreak. The P8 never died completely. You can see its ghost if you know where to look. Some of its styling ideas drifted out into the world on other cars. A few of its design cues turned up, of all places, on a Leyland saloon built in Australia. The instrument layout would feel oddly familiar to anyone who later sat in the Rover SD1. Pieces of a murdered car, scattered and reused, like organs donated from a body that was never allowed to live. And Rover itself. Within a year of the P8's cancellation, Rover was forced into yet another merger and effectively ceased to exist as its own independent company. The proud firm that built the Land Rover, invented the Range Rover, and dared to reach for Rolls-Royce, folded into the machine, its boldest idea sitting dead in a file. That's the part that should stay with you. We tend to think the great lost cars were the ones that failed, the flops, the embarrassments, the ones that deserved to die. The P8 is the opposite. It was good enough to succeed, good enough maybe to stand in the same showroom light as a Rolls-Royce and not look out of place. And it never got the chance, not because customers rejected it, but because it never reached them at all. The cruelest way to lose isn't to be beaten in the open. It's to be switched off in the dark by your own side before the race even starts. That's the Rover P8, the best British luxury car that nobody ever got to buy, and the one the establishment quietly decided you were never meant to know about.